being here. If you would, go ahead and open your Bibles. Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. This evening we're talking about a contentious and polarizing topic. The government. Taboo, I hear in many coffee groups, along with religion, sadly. But probably more taboo in those coffee groups is actually the Bible. That's usually what causes people the most issues. Isn't the discussion of religion, that is man-made religions and what people believe or don't believe, but more precisely the effective use of the Bible to prove what is or should be. And that probably frustrates people more often than anything. But it's a contentious and a polarizing topic. And we've been talking about attitudes behind our worship in our Sunday evening assemblies lately. And tonight I want to talk about the government, in part because it's coming up, the election. And the closer to the elections come, the more polarizing people get, and the more frustrated, the more angry, the more upset people get, and it can get out of hand. I'm glad it hasn't gotten out of hand here. I have been places where we had to ostracize political talk. We had to eliminate it from the congregation, and we basically decided to ban it in the building because it was becoming a contentious thing, even in the brotherhood, which is an unacceptable position for people to take. Why are we going to talk about the government when we're covering our service to God? Well, I want to convey one very important truth tonight that a lot of people get confused on. And I want you to listen. The government is not God. It's not. It's not God. The government does not determine right from wrong. Law doesn't determine right from wrong. The things that people in this country have concluded, according to the Senate and Congress, and I'm not exactly sure always how that works, but the legislative branch decides on laws. But it's funny because we always blame the president, and we focus on the figurehead, which is effectively what the president is, the face. And you might disagree with the president we have, or the presidents we've had in the past, or the presidents we might very well have in the future. But usually the force of power that is exerted in the United States is actually by the legislative branch, not the executive branch, that is Congress and the Senate, rather than the president. And that's the funny thing. We get up in arms, oftentimes, about the wrong position. And then we don't, if you vote for the president, or if you choose not to, that's your prerogative, and we'll talk about that. But we get up in arms, and if you vote for the president, if you feel compelled to exert the force that has been granted to you, which is your right to do, and your opinion to decide whether it's right or wrong to do, then if you're up in arms to do it, then you should do it for the extent of your power to do so, not just for the president. And I have been an individual who has been a part of that in the past and not realized that really the force of the policies in America are actually by Congress and the Senate rather than the president himself. I was unaware of that for a long time. I thought the president decides everything as if he's some kind of a dictator, and that's not exactly how the system is set up, though we treat it as if it is, which is our own ignorance in a lot of cases. The law does not determine right from wrong. Whatever those individuals in those positions decide, America will move forward as long as America is allowed to exist and as long as those individuals are in those positions. But we have that unprecedented ability to have a voice and an influence on how we are governed. And if we choose to utilize that voice and that effect, then we should do so. But we don't like the government because it doesn't go, or because it goes against God's law, we get real mad about it. And when there's a president in office or people are going to be elected that we don't like, we get real mad about it. And when a Christian who votes for a party other than the party we think is the God-accepted party, we get real mad about it. And that anger and that resentment shows in our attitude toward one another. And brethren, that ought not be the case. Politics are not religion. The government is not God. They don't decide things. They don't determine things that have eternal significance, not in truth. And nothing that the government will ever do is going to have eternal significance. They are here for a time. They do whatever job it is that they were here to do, or they don't do their job. I don't know. The government has their job, and we have ours. And we need to respect that we do our job for God, regardless of what the government does. Let us not get the two confused in our attitudes. This contentious and polarizing topic, I'm glad, isn't so much an issue here. We've had issues in the past. But I want us to talk about something that's really important, and something that a lot of people, even in this world in general, as I've talked to people before, they don't realize is in the Bible. Romans chapter 13, I hope you're there with me. Romans chapter 13, I want you to read with me verses 1 and 2. He says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinances of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves." I can't believe that Paul says that. Actually, I can. I hear that all the time. When I'm talking to people and they are outright raging about something that a previous president or the current one or whatever is going on in the political spectrum, they are freaking out about this, and I go right back to Romans chapter 13. If we have control over it, which Paul did not, and Jesus did not, but if we have control over it, if there's some force that we can be a part of, then certainly do so. But if we can't, we live in a world that is outside of our control. We need to learn how to deal with that. We need to learn how to deal effectively with that in a way that is godly, a way that is Christian, and it has a Christian attitude involved. In excuse me, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, in verse 24, I want us to see what Paul has to say, because you got to consider the source of this information, and we're going to say that a couple of times. We're going to go a couple of places, and I want you to consider who is saying the things that are being said. Consider the source. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 24, he says, "From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. To the Jews, that was to keep the person whipping the individual from accidentally miscounting and doing more damage than they were supposed to. It had nothing to do with mercy. He says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. That was a very effective way that the Jews distributed punishment. He says, once I was stoned. And we've heard about that. The Jews had organized a situation where they were able to stone Paul because they gained enough support from the people around them. And so they effectively tried to execute Paul on a number of occasions. But notice, Paul isn't talking about the Roman government. Now, the Roman government would have its hand in a number of things that Paul would be involved in. The Roman government would certainly have a hand in the persecution of Christians moving forward. But the predominant damage that Paul would sustain was from his own people, from the governing individuals that he once represented, that he once worked with to persecute Christians himself. The Jews themselves were administering punishment on Paul. He says there, verse 25, 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, which he was talking about earlier, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. And some of that is going to be at the hands of the Roman government. And he has witnessed what the Roman government is capable of doing. And while they haven't taken direct action during Paul's day, in this case, against Christians all over, they have taken action against those in Rome. Nero has done an extensive amount of persecution of the Christians in Rome, and even lined his garden with Christians that he piked, which means to place aggressively on a stake and then lit on fire. And he rides up and down in his chariot. Paul was not unaware of the persecution even the government themselves were performing. Jesus was not unaware of the persecution that the Romans would bring upon the people of God. And yet, what does Paul say there in Romans chapter 13? The government is there for a reason. Now, we might not always like the government that we have, but you have to admit that Paul and Jesus, among many, would be in a situation where they have a much dire situation in regard to the government that they have. Think about Daniel in Daniel chapter 4, verse 17. He's speaking to the king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most powerful individuals in the world at the time. And he is relaying the message of God, an ability that he has been given only because God has put his people into captivity. He is in a foreign land under a dictator who has shown enmity against his people. And yet, there in Daniel chapter 4, verse 17, this decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, gives them to whomever he will, and sets over them the lowest of men. This kingdom that, by God's authority, conquered your homeland, captured your people, most likely because he was one of semi-royal birth, killed his family, and most likely damaged him physically. Likely these men, all the way back in chapter 1, were castrated. Their manhood was removed. And yet, he is willing to work with that government. Why? Because he can have an influence on it. Because he can help to change the world around him. What if Daniel weren't there? What if Daniel weren't there to be that light to Nebuchadnezzar and then to Darius? And many other individuals along the way. What if they had decided that they hated the government, and they had every reason to? They had direct reason to despise these governmental officials and the damages that they had done. But Daniel realizes, not only here, elsewhere as well, that that's not the path that a person who is submitting to God would take. God put them in this position for a very good reason. And it was for these individuals to follow God regardless. We have been talking regularly about David's respect for Saul. Even though Saul has persecuted him, challenged him, chased him out of town, tried to murder him in a number of occasions, secretly and then openly for a long time. And David has had countless opportunities to kill Saul. And he has been tempted, but avoided all of them, realizing that it was not in his purview to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. When God was ready for him to be king, David knew that he would be king. And that was the end of it. That was the end of the discussion. And while the temptation was always there, because let's be fair, David's human, he was not going to raise a hand against the Lord's anointed, even to the degree that at the very end of 1 Samuel, when he gets word that Saul and, unfortunately, Jonathan and Saul's other sons were killed, the man who delivers that message takes credit for the deaths. He puts that man to death because he had said he raised his hand against the Lord's anointed. So David puts him to death because that was not acceptable. He thought he was going to be rewarded for having taken vengeance on David's hand, or on David's part. And David, no, that's not acceptable. Even if I'm going to be made king, and even if I can argue that it's God's will that this be done, that's not the way it should be done. And so we have a number of instances of individuals who, let's be fair, are in significantly worse situations governmentally than we are. We have a fairly plush way of life here. And while that may change over time, and is changing in the system, we are by no means the worst of the communities that exist of Christians around the world. And we, even around the world currently, are nowhere near the level of persecution that other generations of Christians have faced in the past. Now, I am not saying that we should not move forward and try to encourage good behavior and a relationship with, right, and changes that can be made, and to utilize the influences that we have. I'm not saying we shouldn't do any of those things because we have it good. I'm saying that we should, in a lot of ways, stop complaining and getting so angry because things will change over time, because people will come in who are going to make things harder on us. We should see them as challenges rather than enemies. There are general statements here as well. Romans chapter 13, in verse 3, look what he says here. One of the reasons, you can tell it's one of the reasons, this is part of the way language works. He says for, that means he is drawing a conclusion. He drew a conclusion in verses 1 and 2. We should submit to government. And then because, or for, this is the reason why. He says, for rulers are not a terror to good works. Now that is not always true, but that's a general statement that Paul is making. Like when you read through the Proverbs, not everything the Proverbs say are always the case. They are generalities. They are things that are true on a general spectrum, but they're not always the case every time. He says, the rulers of this world are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. Don't stand out because you want to do wicked things. I mean, that's pretty common, right? He's not suggesting, Paul is by no means suggesting that you shouldn't live your life as a Christian, even if the things you do irritate the government, because he certainly had his fair share of irritating the government when it was godliness that brought that along. But he is not saying you should spurn the government every chance you get simply to be annoying to the government. And yet that is sometimes how we act, both towards the government itself and towards each other. And that ought not be the case. For he is God's minister to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. We also need to remember that God had a system of government, even that he had himself appointed. The governmental system under the Old Testament, the Mosaic covenant, was through a genealogy specifically of David. But if you look overall, there were a lot more bad kings than good kings. And yet God set that establishment up. And he had every opportunity to change at any given point. He actually took 10 tribes during the days of Rehoboam, gave them to an ungodly individual named Jeroboam, and offered to leave them in his custody. And there are no good kings in the northern tribes. There is not a single one. And yet God gave it to him because it was within his purview to do, because it served some purpose. And it's not always clear what God's purposes are, but when we see the ends and the results, sometimes we get an inkling on why he would do things. Sometimes it makes sense, and whether that's why God did it, because it made sense to us or not, I'm not always sure. But if I trust God, and that goes back to that earlier point, Daniel chapter 4, verse 17, is he still in control? Then let's be okay with the things that are happening. Let's use our influence as we can, but let's calm down. Just a little bit, maybe. Just a hair. And let's not freak out at each other especially, simply because we might disagree on policy or on things that need to be done. We can discuss it. We should be able to discuss these things. We should be able to discuss anything. This place, not just this building, but this group of people, let's call it something that the world misuses. Let's call it a safe space. A place where ideas can be discussed, where we can talk about things that may be weird, maybe out of sorts, maybe out of what you would normally talk about in a coffee group. Is it okay that we talk about those things? It needs to be, because those are the things on our minds, and we need to be able to encourage one another and help one another and not get so outraged about everything. There are a lot of things that we should be outraged about that we're not. 1 Corinthians 5. The church in Corinth needed to be outraged about something that they weren't. Let's not be like Corinth. He says, the government is not usually opposed to good deeds. When the church is doing good and helping one another and the community at large, the government's generally not going to get in the way of that. Now, some governments will steal, right? They'll misuse the system that exists but they're not generally against you helping their population, of you doing good in the community. And in most cases, the government is empowered to punish wickedness. Among other things, we'll talk about Matthew 22, verse 21. A number of the reasons that the tax money is collected and you should pay taxes is because the government provides services. The government takes care of things, and maybe they don't take care of things as well as you'd like, and maybe there's bureaucracy and people stealing money from the system, but the system of taxation has been around practically since the beginning. There wasn't any taxes in the Garden of Eden, as far as I know. But shortly after God created the earth, God created man, man created taxes. It's just the way it is. And the government has the empowerment, according even to Paul, considering the empowerment that the government would use would take him all the way to Rome. In chains, but would take him all the way to Rome. Give him access to people that he would not have had otherwise. that's probably not the way Paul thought it was going to play out. Paul's like, hey, God, can I get to Rome? And God's like, yeah, I'll get you to Rome. And Paul's like, well, that's not exactly how I meant. But at the end of the day, when he preached to people that he would have never had access to otherwise, do you suppose Paul regretted any of it? Do you suppose Paul regretted the shipwreck on Malta when all of those people witnessed the power of God and many of them were converted to Christ? Suppose Paul regretted it when he got to meet so many Christians along the way and got to see the support that Christians were able to administer to him? Paul had a big picture vision. And from what I read of Paul, I can't imagine Paul regretted it one bit. Maybe there were moments where weakness comes through, sure. But at the end of the day, think about the clerk in Ephesus. I think this guy's oftentimes forgotten. In Acts chapter 19, there's this clerk in Ephesus, because in Ephesus, a riot starts. And the riot starts because Paul is preaching the gospel and people are converting to Christ, and Christ doesn't believe in idols and doesn't encourage idol makers, which is cutting into the bottom line of a few individuals, some silversmiths and some coppersmiths, a man named Alexander in particular, who will again come up later on in another of Paul's letters as a warning to Timothy. I almost said Titus. Titus goes to Crete. Timothy goes to Ephesus. And Paul even warns Timothy, hey, be careful about Alexander. He's got it out for us. And it was because he was missing his bottom line, because he wasn't able to make money off of these Christians, because they didn't believe in keeping idols. And in verse 35, there's this mob of people that are trying to kill Paul and all of the Christians in the area practically. They are mad at Paul, and they grab a Jewish man out of the multitude, a man who is known to be part of Paul's group. And in verse 35, he says, and when the city clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple guardian of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Zeus? That's a historical quality of Ephesus. They believed that there was a statue of Zeus that literally fell from heaven as if no one made it. And so they believed that was the jurisdiction of Diana there in the city. And when the city clerk, I read that, in verse 36, therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. This guy is keeping the peace. He's doing his job. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in the lawful assembly. For we are in danger of being called in question for today's uproar, there being no reason which we may give to account for this disorderly gathering. And when they had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. There was a riot, and they were going to murder people, literally kill people in this riot. And the clerk in Ephesus settles everyone down. He is a reasonable Gentile. And by Gentile, I mean non-Christian. He is a person outside the body of Christ who supports the ability for Christians to do their faith. And that's all anyone is ever asking for. And by and large, the Roman government allowed Christians to do their thing for a very long time. They became the focal point of, unfortunately, the Roman religion. But the governmental system was designed to allow people to travel. It built roads that allowed Christians to take the gospel all over the world in a relatively safe way and relatively speedy travel. It created a currency that allowed people to buy and sell and trade without having to literally barter chickens for goats, because I don't know what kind of ratio that would work out to be. There are a lot of things that the government is meant to do, and governments have been different from the ages, and they have been different levels of support or disruption towards both Christians and even the Jews in the past. The point remains the same. We have a responsibility, Paul says, to submit to the government for a number of reasons. And that, yes, is limited to when the government is calling you to do something that is not ungodly, that does not restrict your access to God, that does not get in the way, as even in Daniel, when the king decided to make an amendment to the rules that you couldn't plead to anyone, you couldn't pray to anyone but the king for 30 days. What does Daniel do? Goes home? He prays anyway. He doesn't care, because you're not going to get in the way of my relationship with God. That is the proper way of handling things. And yet, we get so upset, we get so outraged, we freak out because things don't go our way all the time. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. There's that word again. For they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. That is to say, you should pay the worker for their work. Now, you might think it exorbitant, and that's an argument that you can have with thankfully in our case, with your legislative branch and the people who decide those things. They couldn't. They had to pay the taxes, or basically a tax crew would come and break your leg. I mean, we're attacking mob mentality in a lot of cases. In verse 7, he says, render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs due to customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And I want you to change something. There at letter A, it says, fear the wrath of the government. And while there's a play on words for the next one, I want you to cross that word out. I hope it says that on your paper. Fear the wrath of the government. Cross fear out and put avoid. And maybe at the end put unnecessarily. That would be more accurate. Avoid unnecessary wrath of the government. There are times where you need to incur the wrath of the government because you need to do your thing as a Christian. You need to do what is your job as a Christian to perform. But we shouldn't look out for things like that. We shouldn't go out of our way to spur the government simply because we feel like it's a responsibility of the Christian to spur the government. Jesus didn't do it. Paul didn't do it. The apostles didn't do it. They came into contact with the government regularly. They dealt with it as they could. It didn't change who they were or what they were called to do, so they managed it as best they could. But they did not go out of their way to cause problems. Not for no reason anyway. And that's the call there in 1 Peter chapter 2. If you suffer for righteousness' sake, that's much better than suffering because you did stupid things. Because you decided that you didn't want to obey the law because you don't think it applies to you, because you're a Christian and God is your lawgiver, but you still reside under a governmental system, and we have been commanded to obey it as far as we possibly can, even when it is capricious, even when it is annoying, even when it does things we would rather it not do. The Roman government collected taxes. And what does Jesus say there in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21? Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And that money was utilized in a number of ways that Jesus would not have been okay with. But it was part of paying his taxes. And so he paid it, because it was more appropriate to pay it and fight a different battle. There are battles that need to be fought, and as much as we'd like them to be, taxes are not one of them. Again, we live in a world where you have some ability to change that. Do so if you can, if it's something important. But there are much more important things to deal with than taxes, just so you know. In Acts chapter 4, verses 19 to 20, Peter and John are arrested, and they are charged not to preach the gospel any longer. And I love their response. It's probably one you're very familiar with. There in Acts chapter 4, verse 19, he says, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. Like, you can decide if it's to you and to this governmental authority, right or wrong for me to preach Christ, but I'm going to do it anyway. That's pretty much what he said. He said, you can stick it in your ear. That's right. Because this is what we're going to do. And unless you're going to actively stop us, which they tried, and it didn't work. They imprisoned Peter a couple of times, and once at least, an angel just guides him right out. We've got to be people who are willing to do what is right regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how we feel, regardless of how irritating the government or whatever it is might be. We have to be properly motivated, though, that we are working for God. And then the question comes up sometimes, I added it at the end, though it seems unnecessary at this point. Can you work for the government? Well, in fact, John the Baptizer deals with that in Luke chapter 3. You had people who were Jews who were working for the Romans, who were collecting taxes, who were working as soldiers. And look there in Luke chapter 3, verses 7 through 14, after he has called out some of the Jews for not being the Jews that they need to be, he tells them that the axe is laid at the root of the tree. God's cutting this tree down, and you need to get out from under it. You need to respect that this way of life is not going to continue this way. God wants it to change. And then some people come desiring the repentance that John has been preaching. And they ask him, tax collectors ask him, what should we do? And he tells them not to collect any more than they're supposed to collect. Do your job. There's nothing wrong with your job. Your job does the job that it's supposed to do. But we work for Rome, and the Jews hate Rome, and we're supposed to hate. Get over it. If you work for Rome, that's fine. Do your job. Don't misuse the authority you've been given. Hey, soldiers, come up. Don't beat someone unnecessarily, which is an interesting concept. Don't be rude and don't misuse the authority you've been given. They're simple concepts. Don't take advantage of the position. There are better things to fight over. And I don't mean fight in a physical way. I mean things to fight against. And the point he's talking about here, and the principle even that John the Baptist is sharing with these Jews, is that they should not forget that their work for the Lord should come first. Who they are is always more important as far as Christians or as these people that they're Jews, is always more important than what you do. If who you are gets in the way of what you do, then you should probably change your profession. If you are an idol maker and you can't transition into silversmithing in legitimate ways that don't involve making idols, perhaps you should get out of that business. And there are a number of categories and departments that would be the case. But we need to recognize that we work for God, and God is not the government. They're oftentimes mutually exclusive. But it's always important for us as Christians to remember who we are called to be, and how we are called especially to treat one another. Our attitudes and how we resolve issues with the government, and especially issues with one another, need to come from the compassion we should have for God and His people.